Marcus Aurelius once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events."
But here's what nobody tells you about that quote: he learned it from people who despised him.
Not his inner circle. Not his mentors. His enemies.
The people who wanted him to fail watched him more closely than anyone who loved him. And that observation, that hostile, uncomfortable, relentless observation, made him sharper.
That's not an accident. That's a pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Your enemies are the only people with a real incentive to find your weaknesses, and that makes them your most accurate mirror. Nietzsche spent years being dismissed, criticized, and ridiculed by his peers and the academic establishment. They picked apart his ideas with surgical precision, not to help him, but to discredit him. But here's the thing: reading his critics is how historians eventually mapped his real philosophical blind spots.
His friends?
They told him he was a genius.
His enemies handed him a roadmap of everything he hadn't figured out yet.
Think about it in your own life. When was the last time a close friend sat you down and said, "You're not as disciplined as you think you are.
You're inconsistent. You say one thing and do another"? Never. Because they care about your feelings more than your growth. But your enemies? They'll say it. Maybe with venom, maybe with ulterior motives, but they'll say it.
And inside that attack is usually a grain of truth you've been avoiding. Psychologically, this works because of what Carl Jung called the shadow, the parts of yourself you've suppressed, denied, or refused to look at. Your friends help you maintain your self-image.
Your enemies attack it. And when they attack it accurately, it stings precisely because it's true.
The discomfort you feel from a well-placed criticism from an adversary is your shadow being exposed.
That sting is information.
Most men flinch from it. The Stoic man minds it. Friendship distorts your self-perception through a slow, invisible process called positive bias drift, and it's quietly making you weaker.
Think about a man you know who everyone calls a great guy. His friends laugh at his jokes even when they're not funny.
They agree with his takes even when they're wrong. They tell him his business idea is solid even when it clearly has problems. Over years, this man builds a completely false model of himself. He overestimates his charisma, his judgment, his capabilities. Then he walks into a room full of people who don't love him, a job interview, a negotiation, a competitive environment, and reality hits like a wall. Seneca warned about this in letters to Lucilius: associate with those who are likely to make you better.
But he didn't say comfortable. He said better.
There's a massive difference.
Comfort is the enemy of accurate self-knowledge.
This is rooted in what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger feedback loop. When the people around you only confirm your competence model inflates beyond reality.
Your enemies break that loop. They don't care about your comfort. They're running a stress test on who you actually are.
And stress tests, painful as they are, reveal structural weaknesses that friendly conditions never would.
The way your enemies describe you is often closer to how strangers see you than anything your friends would ever say. Machiavelli was exiled, tortured, and politically destroyed by his enemies.
But read what they said about him: scheming, calculating, ruthlessly realistic, politically dangerous. Then read The Prince. Every accusation maps directly onto what he actually believed and practiced.
His enemies saw him clearly.
They had to, because understanding him was survival.
Now flip this to a relatable scenario.
You've probably had a situation where someone didn't like you, a coworker or rival, an ex, and they said something about you to someone else. And when you heard it, your first instinct was defensive.
But then, quietly, you thought, is that actually how I come across? Often, the answer is yes. Not because your enemy is wise,
but because they were watching you without the filter of affection. This is called the observer effect in interpersonal dynamics. The people who are neutral or hostile toward you notice your patterns without the softening lens of goodwill. A friend sees you late and thinks, he's going through something.
An enemy sees you late and thinks, he's unreliable. One is empathy. One is data.
You need both, but most men only get the empathy. Resistance from an opponent forces you to develop capabilities that comfort never would. This is what Nietzsche meant by "what doesn't kill me makes me stronger," and it's more literal than motivational. Look at Epictetus. Born a slave, physically disabled after his master broke his leg, publicly degraded, stripped of autonomy. His philosophical output, some of the most psychologically durable thinking in Western history, came directly from navigating a world that was actively hostile to him. Now compare that to the heirs and sons of wealthy men who had every comfort, every yes man, every open door. Who produced more resilient thinking? Epictetus. His adversarial environment wasn't just bad luck. It was a forge. Consider a modern man building a business. If every early investor says yes, every client stays, and no competitor emerges, he never develops sales resilience, retention strategy, or competitive intelligence. Then one hard quarter hits and he collapses. The man who built his business against resistance, who had to fight for every client, who learned through losing, handles that quarter without flinching. His enemies built him. This works through what psychologists call post-traumatic growth and what evolutionary biologists call adaptive pressure. A system, biological, psychological, social, only develops defenses against threats it has actually encountered. Adversity from external opposition triggers genuine adaptation. Comfort triggers stagnation. Your enemies are, in the most literal sense, your trainers. The question is whether you're learning from the training or just resenting it. Using your enemies consciously as a feedback mechanism and a competitive reference point is one of the oldest and most underrated forms of strategic intelligence. Winston Churchill is a popular historical figure, but here's the angle people miss: he kept detailed files on his critics and political opponents. Not to hold grudges. To understand what they saw in him that he might be missing, and to anticipate how they'd move against him. He treated opposition as intelligence gathering. Carl Jung did something similar with patients who challenged or resisted his ideas most aggressively. He paid the most attention to those relationships because resistance, in his view, pointed directly at something real and unresolved. The practical application for you: next time someone in your life, a colleague, a competitor, even an ex, says something critical about you, before you dismiss it, ask one question: what would have to be true about me for this person's observation to be correct? That question is uncomfortable. It's also one of the most useful questions you can ask yourself. This is what Stoics called the dichotomy of control applied to feedback. You can't control what your enemies think or say. But you can control whether you extract value from it. The Stoic move isn't to make peace with your enemies or to love your critics. It's to treat their observations as raw data and decide, with cold clarity, what's signal and what's noise. That skill, filtering hostile feedback for usable truth, is a form of strategic emotional intelligence most men never develop because they never try. So here's what we covered today. 1. Your enemies have the only real incentive to find your weaknesses, which makes their observations more accurate than your friends' reassurances. 2. The people who care about you are slowly building a false model of who you are. Positive bias drift is real and it makes you fragile. 3. Hostile observation is often the clearest mirror you'll ever look into, because it's stripped of the filter of affection. The Stoics didn't run from adversity. They didn't perform gratitude for it either. They used it. That's the move: not to love your enemies, not to forgive and forget, but to extract intelligence from the conflict and come out of it sharper than you went in. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire with enemies on every border, inside the palace and out. He didn't survive by surrounding himself with comfort. He survived by staying clear-eyed about every source of feedback available to him, including the hostile ones. If this resonated with you, subscribe. We drop one every Tuesday and Friday. No filler, no motivation poster philosophy. Just ideas that hold up when things get hard. And if you want to go deeper on this specific concept, the next video breaks down how Stoics actually practiced emotional detachment, not as numbness, but as a tool for clearer decision-making. That one's worth your time.